Well, hello, hello. That it came to me a little bit sooner than it was supposed to. Good thing I wasn't making any funny faces there. Welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Today's conversation is all about OOUX, object-oriented UX. You're going to learn all what that is. It's going to be a really cool conversation. And we're going to talk about OOUX and its relationship to content modeling. With my guest, Carolyn Sober-James. She's the lead product designer at Uniform. Before we get started, though, you know how this works. I'm going to tell you real quick about headlesscreator.com. Get your free account. Once you have your free account, you'll have access to this lesson on demand, but you also have access to the entire course, which will give you basically everything we have in there, which is all of the podcast episodes, lots of tutorials, bonus materials, and then, of course, once you have the account at Headless Creator, you'll also have access to pretty much everything. Check it out. Content Modeling Weekly, Discover Headless Tech, which is this one. A brand new course, the retrospective. Check that one out. Super, super cool. We're going to be launching a episode on November 10th on that one. Weekly tip courses, Headless CMS courses, bootcamp. I mean, we got tons of stuff here. So get your free account. You won't regret it. Now, without further ado, we're going to bring in Carolyn. But before I do, remember, you have a chat in front of you. Go ahead and type in any questions you have for her, and I'll go ahead and ask her. But without further ado, let's bring on Carolyn. Carolyn, welcome.
Hey, good morning, Marcelo. Or happy Wednesday, I should say. I've learned being in a global company with people spread across multiple time zones.
That's right. Happy
Wednesday.
I say
happy Wednesday.
I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is around the world. Yeah, we're definitely, especially after COVID, right? Everybody's everywhere, working from every part of the world. So where are you located?
I am in Madison, Wisconsin, heart of the Midwest.
Oh, nice. Very cool. Is it cool actually over there? Cool as in weather?
It is, yes. And we are moving into a period of pretty brisk temperatures. So I think the kids on Halloween are going to have the thermals on under their costumes and all that. But hopefully it won't snow. It has done that on some previous years.
Well, explain what brisk temperatures are, because for us it would be below 80 degrees here.
Risk for what? Feeling chilly or frostbite?
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay.
Because in the Midwest, you can still have people wearing shorts when it's 40 degrees. It's all relative.
Right.
But I think for the kids on Halloween, like for example, my daughter has a costume that has short sleeves and shorts, and she's adamant that she doesn't want to wear anything under it. And I'm like, well, that's great, but if it's 41, 42 degrees, you're probably going to need something.
And just to clarify, because it is a worldwide audience, 41 degrees Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit,
not Celsius.
Yes, Fahrenheit.
So it's cold. It's very cold.
Yes,
very cold.
chilly.
So, all right, cool. Well, we've got lots to talk about. Let's start with give us your background. How did you get into tech?
By accident. So I was working for a biotech company here in Madison, and I was in the IT organization, but I actually spun up proposed and got approved the first customer experience related role at that company in the early 2000s. And unfortunately that didn't last. I was super young, I was green, the organization wasn't really ready for it. And they were like, good experiment, but we're gonna shift you over to, I ended up doing business analysis, project management, kind of a whole slew of things. And there came a point when my boss at the time kind of called me in and he said, so marketing wants you to come over to their organization. He said, I can either send you over there or I can turn you into a software developer. And at the time, marketing was not where I wanted to be in that organization. And so I said, sure, let's turn me into a software developer. And to their credit, the company sent me to all kinds of training. I mean, it was a fantastic entree into development, and I had a very supportive team, but I had never intended on being a dev. So that's how I got into tech.
What kind of development did you do?
I was, I started off with HTML, CSS, front end stuff. Again, this was like 2003, 2004. And then I switched over to server side dev, started with VB.NET and then C#.NET.
Okay.
And the last 4 years of my time at that company, I was developing for Sitecore. They had a Sitecore implementation.
Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. But, and so, your next question might be, why are you a user experience
Well, yeah, I mean, you got
design?
into design, and definitely, why did you get into user experience?
Yeah.
Which it kind of makes sense to know as a developer. It's a good thing to know, but yeah.
It's an excellent thing to know, and I appreciate all devs because I have empathy for devs, but I especially appreciate the ones who have an understanding and appreciation for user experience, because it's really everybody's job. Some of us, spend a little more focus on it than others, but it's really everybody's job. So, yeah, I had kind of, again, starting with that role at that biotech company where I'd spun up the customer experience role there. That was kind of when I started to get into UX, and found myself really enjoying kind of this idea of, let's make things better for the people who are using them.
Hmm.
And so even after I transitioned into other roles, that was a common thread through my entire career, basically. And when the time came for me to, I mean, I was the dev on the team who other devs would come to and say, how do I make this better? How do I make this more usable? So it was always there. It just wasn't my official role. So when it came time for me to leave that company and move on to my next gig, I actually interviewed for a developer position, and that wasn't a good fit. But to the credit of the CEO at the company I ended up working for, he called me back in. He had seen some of the user experience stuff on my resume, and he called me back in and he said, we're actually looking for somebody to do user experience. Would you want to do user experience? And I said, sure. So I've been kind of fortunate in my career to have two big jumping points that,
Yeah.
first, that I was able to make the jump, and also, I guess, to give myself credit, I was brave enough, or actually scared enough, but willing to do it anyway,
Yeah.
to take the
Worked
leap and
outside your
say,
comfort. You want to be outside your
yeah,
comfort, and which is something I recommend to everybody. When you get too
yeah,
comfortable, it's time to move on.
it's
Don't get
time to
too
move on.
comfortable. Yeah,
Yeah,
totally. That's
absolutely.
awesome. That
Yeah.
that's that's a that's a great journey you had. I wonder what's
It's
going to
been,
be next. We got to talk in
I
five
know,
years and see where you're at.
I
Who
know.
knows? Maybe you're developing rockets.
Who knows? Actually, I would love to be involved with like Mars rover,
There you
kind
go.
of.
See?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I get emotionally invested in those
You
plucky
know
little
what? Why
rovers,
not?
and yeah, right.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
but let's jump into our conversation here. I just real quick. You're at Uniform, which full disclosure, Uniform owns Headless Creator, and you're the lead product designer there. What brought you, real quick? What brought you into Uniform?
Well, one of the co-founders, kind of. I was starting to look for my new position, and it was a previous connection again through the Sitecore community, and um, just sort of struck up a conversation when I was in the early stages of looking for my next thing, and it went very fast, and it was a good fit. And so I think the background that I have in Sitecore and headless CMSs in general, and then all the user experience stuff, and the highly structural nature of the design work I do, which is directly the OOUX piece. It was just a good fit. So it's been a good jump. I'm a total noob at Uniform. I just started the beginning of September, so I'm coming to the end of month two. But it's been great, and I'm
Well,
learning a
glad to
lot.
have
And
you with
yeah,
us. It's awesome.
good.
All right, now you mentioned OOUX, but before
Oh
we
yeah.
jump into OOUX, let's just to clarify for other people, define UX and what is the difference between UX and for most people they know it as UI. I mean, there's a clear
Sure.
difference.
Yeah, so UX, user experience, is really the holistic experience that a human has interacting with. In general, user experience is considered to be around digital products or services. So websites, applications, even some of the virtual assistants, the A word we were talking about. Don't say her name because she might
That's
answer you,
right.
sort of
That's right.
thing.
She'll
Yeah.
start talking with us here.
So, and user experience is a subset of customer experience, and customer experience goes cross-channel. That involves everything from your website or application to the experience somebody has with sales, to the experience they have with your support function, that whole thing. So customer experience is the big piece, and then user experience is a subset of that. And then UI, or user interface, is sort of the practical expression of um, how you facilitate the user experience in a digital product. So that would be how screens are set up, the controls you use, the screens you use to move people through workflows and allow them to accomplish goals, kind of thing. And there's sort of this hot button. I very often will say I'm a UX UI designer. I don't get precious about one versus the other, but there are people who can get very prickly about UX is not UI, and that's fair.
Well, it is fair, because one thing I didn't think about, which you just mentioned, I always think of UX as the entire digital experience for a user, but you talked about customer support. I mean, customer success, all of that is part of the user experience too, that you got to think through, right? Both digital and offline.
It is, but in general, I found that when people think about user experience, it's more focused on the digital pieces
Right.
of the experience, and customer experience is that broader cross-channel experience. But definitions are fuzzy. I mean, it's like everybody has a slightly different way of thinking of stuff. But in general, I think of it as, customer experience is the big umbrella. User experience is a little bit more defined part of that, dealing with digital pieces, and then UI is how we actually structure those digital pieces and build them so that people can have a good user experience and get done what they want to get done.
So we got user experience defined, but we're here to talk about OOUX. So real quick, explain OO, and then in the context also of OOUX.
Sure. So OOUX, object-oriented user experience, is a design philosophy that allows us to create software that aligns with the mental model, the real world mental model that people have of a world of concrete and defined objects. And object orientation is it predates OOUX significantly. I think some of the first mentions of OO were like in the 1950s or something like that. And developers have been working in object-oriented ways for a long time. That's rather than procedural programming, sort of do this, then this, then this, then this. Object-oriented allows you to sort of define this whole system of objects that may relate to each other in different ways or be able to act on each other in different ways, but they are sort of atomic things. They have their own data, they have their own state, and it's a different way of thinking about programming. And OOUX, there are some parallels, there are some analogs with OOP, object-oriented programming, but it's not meant to be. This is painting UX with object-oriented programming. It's not meant to be that. So with object-oriented user experience, or OOUX, we are working. We're taking what has traditionally been, for a lot of designers, a much more task-based or procedural approach, where, historically, a lot of times designers would say, well, I need to design the login flow or the search flow or the e-commerce flow or whatever. And it's understandable why that happened, but the challenge there is that you can't really effectively design a workflow for something until you better understand all the things that make up that workflow and how they relate to each other, and kind of what that foundational set of objects is. And the reason that that's important is that that's how our brains work. Humans think in objects. There's a whole, Sophia Prater is the creator of OOUX. She developed this after working at CNN, actually, on the election night web interfaces for 2012 and 2016, the presidential election, presidential and other elections. And that's a whole backstory that I won't go into, but she kind of came up with the initial kernels of OOUX after an experience there, sort of showed her there might be a better way to do this. And so she wrote one of the articles that she's written called The Object-Oriented User, and it goes into all of this brain-based science about how we think in objects. Thought is object-oriented. The way we communicate is object-oriented. The way we understand the world is object-oriented. The way we perceive the world is object-oriented. So the real world, the physical world, has conventions related to the objects in it that allow us to navigate that world effectively, happily, safely. And the challenge with digital is that the constraints that are in the real world aren't there for digital. So
Mm-hmm.
we can unintentionally create something that makes absolutely no sense to people. So the goal with OOUX is to understand the mental model of the people who are using our digital product, understand their mental model for all of the objects that make up this problem domain that we're working in, or subject matter domain that we're working in, and figure out what are those objects, what's their structure and composition, how do they relate to each other, how do I relate to them as a user, and then as a user, what is my role in the system, sort of thing. So with OOUX, we're exploring all that stuff before we ever get to screens.
It
And
sounds a lot like content modeling.
there's significant parallels, I think,
Yeah.
between OOUX and content modeling. And I've not been a content modeler. I wouldn't call myself a content modeler, but my understanding of content modeling is that there are significant parallels. The goals, I think, have some difference. You know, with OOUX, ultimately the goal, at least as the methodology was originally defined and designed, the ultimate goal is to design screens, design digital experiences that are frictionless, highly goal oriented. Basically, I think good software is invisible. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
can get in and you can get something done and you can get out and you barely know that you've been in the software. There was a guy I saw speak at a Microsoft Tech Ed a million years ago, it might have been 2003 or something like that. His name's David Platt, and he had written a book called Why Software Sucks. And he said a quote that has stuck with me ever since then. He said, people don't want to use your software.
Right.
They want to have used it to get something done. So the goal is to create something that is so natural and matches the mental model so closely that it's just effortless to use.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that in OOUX, you don't focus on designing the login page. You focus more
Mm-hmm.
on the objects. Can you provide a little bit more concrete examples of what do you mean by that when we're talking about that
Yeah,
aspect?
yeah, and with OOUX, we actually don't even concern ourselves with things like the login page or the About Us page. Those are singletons, and we
Mm-hmm.
ultimately will have to design them. But what we concern ourselves with and focus on is within this problem domain that we're talking about. What are the objects that have structure, instances, and purpose and value to the user? So for example, in a recipe site or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
we would have the things that are of value are recipes, ingredients, cuisines, chefs, maybe, um, menus, those kinds of things. So we're exploring what are those things and defining what are the attributes of all those things, and then how do those things interrelate to each other, and how might somebody want to act on those. Um, and that is our initial input to down the road designing screens where we can represent those objects in our digital system in a way that's highly componentized, highly recognizable, highly familiar, so that when somebody comes across a particular object in our system, they can recognize it in those like couple of milliseconds, that it's not like they have to look at it and be like, what is that thing again? It's like, oh, that's a recipe. Oh, that's a chef. Oh, that's a menu,
Got it. That
kind of
makes
thing.
total sense. First of all, it's a total tie-in to content modeling because you could
Mm-hmm.
tie in that recipe to a content model of recipe, which includes ingredients, which has relationships to maybe a chef, blah, blah, blah.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and then, so the follow-up question on that is, so it sounds like you've got these objects, but then you have the actual. At the end of the day, you've got to present them in a screen somewhere, or
Mm-hmm.
in a different, not in a screen, right? For example, we spoke at the beginning, the A lady, right? It's not a
Mm-hmm.
screen. So by identifying these objects, you're abstracting it from the device where it's going to be delivered to, I guess.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. We don't really care about device. We don't care about channel. What we care about is developing this system of understanding and
Right.
and deep structure for the things we might have to represent in an interface, whatever form that interface might take. Excuse me. But one of the steps we take in an OOUX approach is we do a lot of prioritization work. And what that prioritization work is really useful for is directly feeding into some of these decisions around, okay, what are we going to, because we want the experience interacting with an object to be familiar and consistent across channels too, across devices. We don't want interacting with our recipe base on the A lady to be a drastically different experience than interacting on the website. We want those to feel like the same thing, just a different delivery mechanism. Yeah. So, so this prioritization that we do facilitates things like mobile first. It facilitates things like release management, or deciding what's our MLP phase, what's our minimum lovable product, and then what can we layer in. So it's very channel agnostic. It's very device agnostic. What we're really trying to understand, or what we're really trying to build, is a system of understanding, and highly define this thing we need to design, because well-defined leads to well-designed.
Right. So I was going to ask you what are some of the challenges with OOUX, but I can immediately see, because it's the same challenge with content modeling. Because what you defined is you have to do the same thing in content modeling, but you got to get a whole bunch of people on board in an organization to all agree some sort of taxonomy, all of these things that you got to agree on to be able to implement this. Is that one of the challenges of doing OOUX? And who are the roles that should be involved in creating this entire user experience, these objects?
Yeah. So yes, I think the primary challenges in OOUX are organizational challenges.
Right.
They are because this is an extremely low fidelity methodology. You spend a lot of time in Trello boards. I mean, I do my object maps in Trello. It's super lo-fi. And I think with design in particular, there's this very understandable, people want to get to screens.
Yeah.
Like, well, let's see what it's going to look like. It's like, I get that. I really get that. But jumping to that too quickly is a mistake. And it's expensive. It's way more expensive to rejigger a wireframe or a comp than it is to move Trello cards around, right?
I so understand this, because with content, and I keep going to content modeling because this is also about content modeling and how it ties in, but it's exactly the same issue, because people just don't want to spend time in Miro or whatever tool you're using to create it. They just want to put it in the headless CMS and start entering data, but it's so expensive to fix it later. And I've been called later to fix these content models that aren't scalable. And it sounds like it's the same issue with UX design if you don't take this OOUX approach.
It is. And from my previous job, I have a very concrete example of that. So we were working with the Wisconsin School of Music Association, and they're doing for the pandemic pivot, they had to take these in-person solo and ensemble festivals for kids playing flute and getting graded on their performance. They had to take that to a virtual system, and we had a very limited amount of time to do it. And so we started off with an OOUX approach and spent a few weeks kind of in this mode, but we delivered a custom, tip to tail, a custom application for this in 7 weeks. And, it was kind of like, if somebody said, well, weren't you concerned about spending that time up front to do this, all this lo-fi sort of, it's like, if we hadn't done that, there's no way we would have made that timeline. It just wouldn't have happened.
So what do you tell somebody in an organization that wants to implement OOUX? How can they go around convincing people, almost being an evangelist of OOUX? But what do they have to say or do to convince people that, hey, this is, yes, we're going to spend some time at the beginning without getting you the deliverable you want, but it's really going to pay off at the end. How do you do this?
So there are a few ways to do it. One is just to sort of do some guerrilla OOUX on the side, and then bring it in and say, here's an object map that I just made for this thing that we're working on. Can you help me figure out? And sometimes it's good to say, I did this for me. I didn't do this. I did this for me, for my understanding.
Right.
And then you have people walk through that with you and they start to provide input to it. And then it starts to click. And what was interesting, again, in my previous role, which was an agency, I would use this as a key discovery tool and requirements gathering tool with clients. And they got it. I mean, it took like no time, and they were latched on, because it was just, it's not technical and it's not really design heavy. It's just talking about this space that we're trying to serve. So guerrilla work is one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is to take something internal and low risk and say, I would like to do an experiment. I'd like to try this. You know, if there's some internal initiative that's been, kind of waiting in the wings, or is low priority or low risk or whatever, just say, I want to take that as a pet project and I want to try this. And it's usually one of those things, once people see it and once they start to get a hold on it, they figure out pretty quickly, oh, this makes sense. In the design realm, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to hear the, now when do we see screens kind of thing,
Right.
but it still helps introduce the idea that this is valuable work and this is valid work, and this is the best way to give us a strong foundation so we don't have to unwind stuff and we do it later.
And I can definitely say that approach works 100% of the time, because I've used the same approach on the content modeling side in my previous company that I work for. I mean, you've got to do it as your side thing, because people aren't going to believe you until they see it, and then present it as your side thing, even during your lunch break or whatever it is.
Yep.
But then it clicks, and you
Yeah.
slowly start convincing people over. But it's a lot of work. So it sounds like getting OOUX implemented organization beyond the science and all the knowledge you need to be an evangelist and a true believer of this.
You do. You need to be an evangelist. And OOUX, it's not a hard methodology. It's not a difficult thing to learn, but it is a specific thing to learn.
Right.
So you need to have at least one person in the organization who understands the mechanics of it and how to actually do it. And then it's fairly easy to bring, at least in my experience, it's been fairly easy to bring other people along. And even if they don't ever become sort of that OOUX practitioner, they're a participant. And you had asked about the roles involved. So, I mean, at minimum, you just need the one person on the team who can kind of drive this and provide some of the OOUX related inputs to the process. But there's room for, OOUX, even though it was initially conceived as a design methodology, it has significant benefits through the entirety of a project or product lifecycle. I mentioned that it's excellent for discovery and requirements gathering purposes. It obviously is great for design. It's also very beneficial from a development standpoint. When done early enough, if the devs haven't already started building out their data models, it's a really strong foundation for data modeling, really strong foundation for API design, because it's taking a very similar approach to what devs already would be doing. If they were taking a problem and trying to come up with a code solution for it. So design, dev, and then even into support and training. Some of the deliverables that we do for OOUX can become a really ongoing and key resource for people, even onboarding, because we'll describe what are these objects in this domain that we're trying to manage. And, so it gives people a resource to go in and get familiarized with what is the space that we're trying to serve.
Yeah.
So tip to tail.
Go ahead, finish your thought.
So tip to tail, it has benefits. So where I was going with that was that there's room at the OOUX table for people completely cross-functionally. Completely cross-functionally. And the one thing that I sort of demand, quote unquote, when I'm doing OOUX is I want a dev in those conversations early. Devs should be in the conversations early anyways, because they have they can add nothing but value. Even just sitting in to early conversations, they are starting to think about how we might solve the problems. They can bring up questions that non-technical people at the table wouldn't ever think of. So, and the same is true with OOUX. going through an object mapping exercise, for example, with a dev at the table, for one thing, it's tremendously helpful. And I've been told this by multiple devs. It's tremendously helpful for the devs at the table to be part of this conversation, because they're already starting to, parallel path the stuff that they have to do, but they're also able to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it ultimately ends up being a much stronger foundation than it would have been if we waited and threw the package over the wall to the devs, like, here you go. This is what you have to work with, kind of thing.
Right. So, yeah, they get to see the big picture. Again, many parallels to content modeling, right? Because it's the same thing in content modeling. You've got to get your dev involved at the beginning, your content authors. I would even argue that you want to partner. I would say that the content architect, the one person involved in content modeling, should partner up very early with the OOUX person.
Yeah.
Because it's, at the end of the day, you're going to be working off of the same objects, right, of the domain in the organization.
Agreed.
So,
yeah, 100%.
Totally. Yep. Cool. So we're getting pretty close to the end. We're a little bit over half an hour right now, but still we got some more things to cover. ORCA, explain what ORCA is and what are these for? What does it stand for, first of all? We always have so many acronyms. And then there's 4 pillars to it. What are they?
Yeah, so ORCA, if OOUX is the philosophy or the way we approach design, ORCA is the process or the methodology. And ORCA is an acronym. It is, so it stands for the 4 pillars are what make up the acronym. So O is objects. Objects are, what are the objects in the user's mental model for whatever this thing is. R is the relationships. What is the relationship between all the objects or potential relationships between all the objects? C is the, I learned it as capabilities, but I think the official canon has switched to CTAs. So what are the things that people might need to do or want to do to or with each particular object? And then A is attributes. What is the core content and metadata that makes up one of our objects? So what constitutes a recipe? What constitutes a chef in our system, sort of thing. So ORCA, those are the 4 pillars of the ORCA process.
Got it. Which, again, completely, and I keep going back to this because the podcast is about the relationship with content modeling, but that completely ties in with content modeling, right? You have objects, you have relationships between objects, you have attributes that objects have, and you have actions. What can you do with that object, right? Which then ties into your development part. So it all comes together here, really, for an organization. There's something called 4 rounds of ORCA. What's you want to cover that?
Sure. Yeah. So if you do ORCA end to end, it's 15 steps. It's a big thing. It's an entire meat grinder. Like, you put user research up front and you get the best solution sausage ever out the other side. So the 4 rounds, is iterating over the ORCA 3 times. The first 3 rounds, the first one is discovery. That's when we're sort of smoking out the complexity of a system. We're understanding what is this problem domain. And so in that first discovery round, there are activities relating to objects. So we're doing noun foraging. We're uncovering what are all the potential objects that we might want to address in the system. For the R piece in discovery, we're doing a nested object matrix. So for our candidate objects, we'll make a matrix. We'll take the 2 axes, and then we'll come to the intersection, and we'll say, what might be the relationship between these 2 objects? Maybe there isn't one, but we explore what are those potential relationships. For the C, we're also doing a matrix, but it's by role. So we're saying, for the roles that we're expecting our system to serve, what are the CTAs that we may want to accommodate? What's the interactivity that we may want to accommodate?
And by the way, CTAs, we're talking about click-through actions?
Calls to action.
Or calls to action. Calls to action. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, same thing.
Yep. And then A, the attributes. This is where we're starting to flesh out the object map, which is an early and super key deliverable through the whole process. So that's an example of how we would, in the first discovery round, do particular activities around each of the 4 pillars. So after the discovery round, there's the requirements round, which can be a really gnarly and complex round, but we're again iterating through the pillars, and there's activities related to each. The third round is prioritization, where we're taking all this stuff that we've defined and all this detail that we've gathered, and we're saying, okay, this is all really great, but there's only so many hours in the day, and we have these limitations. So, and maybe there's even some things that we just flat out don't want to accommodate. So how do we take what we have and start to make the hard decisions about, are we going to deprioritize some objects, like we're just not going to worry about them, or they're not really where we're focusing? What maybe there's some relationships that, yeah, we could explore those, but let's parking lot those because they're not critical, or they'd be really hard and we just don't want to tackle them right now, or whatever. Same thing with CTAs, like what's the interactivity we absolutely need to accommodate, and then attributes. If we think about this kind of from a data perspective too, all these potential attributes on an object, what do we actually want to be maintaining and then reflecting in an interface? So prioritization round. The fourth round is called representation. And that one, we aren't iterating across the pillars. And that's why it's 15 steps rather than 16. So in the representation round, that's when we finally get to screens. We're starting to, map out flows, storyboards, wireframes, taking all this really fantastic foundational information that we have and then putting it into some visual representation. And with that project I referred to earlier with the Wisconsin School Music Association, it was really funny because we'd spent this time doing OOUX work at the front. And when I showed them the first set of wireframes, it was almost a non-event. It was like, yeah, that's kind of what we've been talking about. So it really just kind of greased the whole process. And by the time we got to screen, so many of the decisions had already been made that it was really just like, okay, what controllers are we going to use for this? And sometimes even the control use is somewhat dictated by some of the earlier work. But it really made the screens not so much an afterthought, but just way easier, mostly right the first time, rather than, well, here's a thing, react to it, and then we'll, kind of tweak it all over the place. So yeah, 15 steps, 4 rounds. That said, one of the things that I love so dearly about OOUX is that you don't have to do the whole process. Any amount of it that you add to a project adds value. And I've seen this over and over again. Even if it's only like, I'm going to take 2 hours to do some noun foraging and do a core object relationship diagram just so I understand how all these objects might relate to each other, that's super valuable. In fact, I don't think I've ever done the full 15 steps of ORCA.
Well, I was going to ask, I could see somebody in an agile process going, wait. We work in sprints. We got to deliver stuff in 2 weeks. Yep. How does these rounds and this entire process fit in within an agile process where you're delivering, your sprints in every 2 weeks? Like, do you go through all 4 rounds or part of the 4 rounds through the sprints? I mean, explain a little bit on that.
You can do, you can do sprints that are just related to the ORCA process, where you do an abbreviated version of that to sort of inform a development sprint that might follow. I don't know, and I've actually not had to do that myself previously, but I know it has been done. You probably could smush them together. That might be asking a lot of a particular sprint, but it doesn't have to be like, oh, hold on, we need to take 2 months and go through the entire ORCA process before we can develop. It's very nimble, it's very flexible, and it's kind of like, all right, yeah, before we get started on this thing, let's do a little bit of object mapping just so we kind of understand what the objects are that we're dealing with here.
Right. Now you keep mentioning object mapping. Explain object mapping just a little more detail.
Yeah, so object map is probably the closest analog that OOUX has to a content model. So with an object map, that's where we're taking some lo-fi representation. Again, I use Trello for mine, where you are taking the objects in Trello. You would use an object per lane, and then name the lane for the object. And yeah, it's you take the lane.
So you're talking about the
lanes,
object. Yeah.
Yeah, the lane with the object, and then you use cards to reflect the attributes within a particular object. So, and the cards then have different types. So you would have core content, which are things that belong solely to the instance of an object. So that would be like name, ID, email address, social security number, things that are not likely to be shared. So core content are the things that belong solely to the instance of an object. ORCA is very color coordinated. When we used to do this on whiteboards and we'd use stickies, core content is yellow. And then the next type of card that we can add is a metadata. And so that's something that might be shared between different instances of an object. So, and those are things that could be used for sorting or filtering. So status, difficulty, price, date, those kinds of things would be metadata. Then another type of card would be an object relationship card. And the metadata ones, are pink. Object relationship cards show how this object, this lane that we're working with, how it relates to other things. So recipes this chef has created, ingredients that are part of this recipe, menus this recipe is on, or whatever. And
or
those are in blue.
Part of dish, or yeah.
Yeah, and those are in blue. And then the last type is calls to action or capabilities, and those are the pins that we drop for interactivity. And those can actually be really good seed source of user stories later. So we'll say for the calls to action on a recipe, for example, what are things you might want to do with a recipe? You might want to save it. You might want to favorite it. You might want to share it, that kind of thing. You might want to convert it for some other purpose. And the CTAs are in green. So the object map is this, in my case, Trello board. There are different ways to do it, but it's this representation of there's these objects, and then we're reflecting the attributes and the relationships that object is.
And I can see how that directly ties into development. You got your recipe, which then you have methods for the recipe, like share it, create it, delete it, all that kind of stuff, right? And then that can tie into a content model where you have the recipe content model where you're actually storing all this information in a headless CMS. So I think it does make sense to have all these people at the beginning. So we've covered a lot, but then people will ask, well, we have design systems. Where does that fit in this whole process?
So they're
sounds
complementary.
Like pretty close at the end.
They're more at the end. They're very complementary. The way that I've seen it referred to, and I think this is a good distinction, is that the design system is a system of implementation and consistency. It says that once we've decided what these pieces are, the shapes these objects might take, once we've decided what those shapes are, we want to have a consistent presentation for them and be able to manage that. So design systems are about implementation, alignment to brand standards, that whole thing. There's some specific things that design systems are concerned with. The OOUX approach is more establishing that system of understanding. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of establishing the system of understanding, we are able to create designs that support and reinforce that system of understanding, which then becomes the instructions. Basically, it's a key input for creating the design system. So again, those things can certainly happen. Somebody other than the OOUXer was responsible for design system. I think there's value in that person being involved in those conversations, because the level to which we break these components down into the design system is certainly something that person would probably want to be involved with, either thinking about early, like a dev does with their code, or helping to shape by virtue of the input that they provide to the conversation. Yep. So highly complementary, not a replacement for either. Neither, one doesn't replace the other. And I don't think you could do design system effectively before doing OOUX work, if you were going to do OOUX work. Agreed. So I think OOUX probably does have to come first. Unless you like doing rework in your design system.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's a perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. Last question is, where do you see the future of OOUX? What would you like to see in 5 years?
Oh, well, what I would like to see is this approach getting a lot more traction. And it is getting traction. It's getting kind of more and more known, and more people are using it. There is a certification program now for certified OOUX strategists. I'm part of cohort 1 of that. I've got like certificate number 15, but I think there's over 100 people worldwide now who are certified, and the cohorts keep filling up. So word is spreading, and so my hope is that OOUX continues to gain a foothold and cement itself as a very strong approach to UX in general. And I say that not just because I'm a huge fan of the methodology myself, but because I have seen over and over and over again all of the practical benefits that it offers to the entirety of a project team and the entirety of a project. And so it's just a smart add. It's absolutely the biggest power tool I have in my design toolkit, and I want more people to have it. So, and as the delivery channels get more and more varied, we start getting AR, VR, all this good stuff kind of coming in, having this highly structural device channel agnostic approach to design, I think will become more and more important.
Yeah, so definitely.
So my hope is that OOUX takes over the design world.
Definitely. All right, Carolyn, thank you. And thank your dogs too. Tell them later. Thank you so much for that. It was wonderful.
So sorry.
I love their opinion. No, it's okay. Not at all. Not at all. I really appreciate it. People want to get a hold of you. Is the email the best place that you showing there?
At uniform.dev. Feel free to reach out. Love to talk about OOUX.
Very cool. Thank you, Carolyn. Or dogs. Yeah. I love dogs too. So Carolyn, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
And thanks to the rest of you. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this interview. I know I did. And stay tuned for many more. We got tons of cool interviews coming up. So, and as always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo@headlesscreator.com. As always, have a great one, and we'll see you on the next episode. Cheers.